The reading this Shabbat is from Parashat Vayeshev, Genesis 37:1 to 40:23. Now, it's the story of Joseph and his brothers, the 12 sons of Jacob, which has a dramatic ending and a riveting beginning. The story has every element of a thrilling novel: hate, love, sex, evil intent, plotting to murder. It's the story of family conflict, which is an underlying theme from the beginning to the end of the Bible, as we discussed in our prior two Shabbat portions. We see the lowest values, rejection of and by family members, poverty, wealth, power, intrigue, and a very unwise young man who knew God was telling him something, but was foolish in the way he told his family about it. I mean, what family would not become upset if the youngest child began telling them that soon they'll all be bowing down to him, even including his parents? Before we start out with the things that I want to highlight today, I want to point out that soon we will be celebrating Hanukkah. In fact, next Shabbat, we will not be meeting for our usual Shabbat service. Instead, we'll be having our annual Hanukkah fellowship in the evening. Why do we do this? Hanukkah means dedication, and it is mentioned in the Gospel of John 10. There we read, then came Hanukkah in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Yeshua was walking around inside the temple area in Shlomo's colonnade. You know, it quite amazes me how the first 40 years of my life, I overlooked this passage because these words held no meaning to me. Why was this even written in John's Gospel? First, John was a Jew, so this holiday event was meaningful to him, something he celebrated his entire life. It apparently was meaningful to Yeshua as well, because the only times we ever hear of the adult Yeshua being in Jerusalem was during a biblical feast day. Once I gained that understanding, it caused me to look at our faith's typical winter festivals and holidays celebrated by the mainstream church quite differently than I ever had. This mention of Hanukkah as the Feast of Dedication is one of the first mentions of this holiday feast in literature anywhere outside the book of Maccabees. Now, with this mention of this traditional man-made festival in the New Testament, and that clearly Yeshua participated, it leaves no room for doubt that his followers ought to celebrate it, right along with him. And just to make sure to ruffle a few feathers, note that Christmas is not mentioned. Neither are Christmas trees, manger scenes, Santa Claus, nor the giving of gifts. There's much more to understand about Hanukkah and the origins of Christmas that I will discuss at next week's Hanukkah fellowship. Now back to Joseph and his brothers. The story of Joseph is one of the longest continuous stories in the Bible, which means it must have great significance to us beyond the typical child Sunday school stories that we've all heard. I'd like to discuss the interplay of hate and criminal intentions on the one side and the success and wisdom on the other side. Actual and true revelation from God will nearly always cause people to despise and shun God worshipers. Us. You. The same dynamic is what happened to the greatest prophets of the Old Testament. Here's in Just one example. Amos 7, verses 12 through 16. Amaziah also said to Amos, "Go away, seer, go back to the land of Judah, earn your living there, prophesy there. Don't prophesy anymore at Betrayal, for this is the king's sanctuary, it's a royal temple." Amos gave this answer to Amaziah, "I'm not trained as a prophet. I'm not one of the guild prophets. I own sheep. I grow figs. But Yehovah took me away from following the flock. And Yehovah said to me, go prophesy to my people Israel." So now hear what Yehovah says. You say, do not prophesy against Israel. Don't lecture the people of Isaac. Amos was told to take his prophecies somewhere else. They're not welcome here. So Amos is not the exception to this rejection just because what he has to say is a true and critical message from Yehovah. Isaiah, Zechariah, Jeremiah, all the other prophets were rejected and at times physically beaten and imprisoned. One of my pet peeves is that it seems like every group of God worshipers who are part of a church, a synagogue, or a fellowship has at least one person who honestly believes they're a prophet. These people love to report that they had a vision or a revelation, especially that they have a word of the Lord for you. It matters not a whit that their prophecies never tend to prove out. They come right back with more, and people still open their ears to hear them. Some of these self-proclaimed prophets become big-time preachers and pastors and like to call themselves apostles, even patriarchs. Most of the ones I've heard that claim to have seen apocalyptic visions and revelations have probably seen them in the movie theater or read them on an internet article. Joseph was despised by his brothers. Even his parents had some pretty serious doubts that his visions and dreams were really from God. Joseph, however, was convinced that these were from God. And the proof of this is he did not doubt God's promises. He was willing to believe and act upon those dreams and visions with courage and faith that never wavered. Not even when all seemed lost, as he languished in jail in Egypt because of a lie told against him. Joseph knew one thing to be sure. The visions that he saw in his dreams were from God, and they will eventually be true, no matter what kind of roads and difficulties he may have to travel through and experience. He is putting his faith, his trust in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, his forefathers. See, there's a great lesson for us all to learn from Joseph's example. But oh, how very hard it is to apply to ourselves. Watch and listen as it plays out, and you won't miss it. You know, Bible students can too easily get caught up in the behavior of Joseph's brothers, or on the lying wife of Potiphar who tried to seduce Joseph, or on the suffering of the innocent Joseph languishing in an Egyptian jail. The bottom line is that deep down in his soul, Joseph knew that all this suffering, rejection, pain he was dealing with was not less or more than being schooled to learn the lessons of life that he and all of us will need in order that God's final purposes are achieved through him and through each and every one of us. It is the mystery of suffering and calamity that almost all of us will at one time or another have to live through. The only question is, how will we perceive it? Will it turn us into bitterness, self-pity, or to accepting that we are each just one small cog and a great divine machine that our God has created and controls for the greatest of all purposes, redemption. Joseph received the vision of what God wants him to do and to be, and he believed it. And his faith gave him the strength to walk through it without losing courage, becoming doubtful, seeking to run away from God's plan for his life. You know, the road can be hard. It can be easy to have second thoughts. Did the dream I saw actually come from God? Was that dream only a result of my narcissistic disorder of thinking I'm great and divinely chosen? You know, life has taught me that despite my mental knowledge of this divine dynamic, knowing and living it out are two different things. Knowing, believing, and trusting each have their role in our lives. We are to seek the knowledge of truth. Take it to heart. Believe it. But then we must trust so sincerely in it that we behave and respond to that knowledge. There could be so many different ideas and suggestions that come through our minds when we really do hear from God. In fact, I confess that it can be so very hard to know when we're actually hearing from God and when it's our own inner self speaking. Knowing God's Bible, beginning to end, is the best touchstone for knowing if what we think we hear is from God, because God never tells us something different, nor does he alter his pattern from what we read in his holy word. Those who consider themselves super spirit-filled but do not know the Torah, the prophets, or even the New Testament can be easily fooled. So very difficult for us to be certain enough of what we think we hear God telling us to actually devote our lives to it. Joseph, however, had the resolve to walk the dream through, to stand on the promises of God at all cost, to be willing to be rejected by humans, even his family, or even to become a slave at the hands of his own family. Joseph was not only faithful to the Lord, he was also faithful to his father, Jacob, and to his brothers, the same brothers who hated him so much they couldn't even say shalom to him. When Jacob sent Joseph on a mission to check and see how his older brothers are doing, Joseph immediately, without any argument or discussion, packed up his bag and went from the south side of Canaan up above the city of Shechem, which they called Nablus. You know, for a young man like Joseph, it would have taken around 7 days of hard walking. So Jacob told Joseph to go and check on the welfare of his brothers as they were moving around their flocks of sheep as needed to find good pasture and water. And when he arrived in Shechem, his brothers were no longer there. So since Joseph was well aware that his brothers didn't like him, he easily and truthfully could have just returned home and told his father, Jacob, you know, I went to Shechem just as you asked me to look for my brothers, but they weren't there. I have no idea where they wandered off to. This would have been reasonable behavior for a person who was sent on a mission that was not pleasant or profitable or interesting for him. However, Joseph didn't do that. When a man in Shechem asked him what he was looking for, Joseph answered in Genesis 37:14-17, he, Jacob, said to him, now go see whether things are going well with your brothers and with the sheep and bring back word to me. So he sent him away from the Hebron Valley. He went to Shechem, where a man found him wandering around in the countryside. And the man asked him, what are you looking for? Looking for my brothers, he answered. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the sheep. And the man said, well, they've left here because I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Joseph was determined to do the right thing, not the easy thing. He would obey his father at nearly any cost. See, this attitude of Joseph is the attitude God wants to have above all our endeavors, whether it is with our fellow man or in our relationship with him. It's the same attitude that Yeshua, our Messiah, instructed us to have. It's the attitude that enough self-confidence and determination to not allow the adversary nor our own personal evil inclinations to dictate our behavior. Every God worshiper has and will continue to wrestle with these dual inclinations of good and evil within us. We must not allow our emotions, what others have done to us in the past, to dictate our behavior. Hormones and anger and hurt and pain, these are real, tangible. It cannot be dismissed with lofty words and proverbs. Yet they can and must not be allowed to rule over our faith and reason and our God-given duty to be at peace with all our fellow man, at least as much as it is up to us. The Apostle Paul had much to say about this in Romans chapter 12. In his extensive treatise on the matter, he said this, as it directly concerns Joseph's condition, is something we will assuredly find ourselves in someday. In Romans 12:16-18, be sensitive to each other's needs. Don't think yourselves better than others, but make humble people your friends. Don't be conceited. Repay no one evil for evil, but try to do what everyone regards as good. If possible, and to the extent it depends on you, live in peace with all people. Joseph was beset with all sorts of hatred, envy, misunderstandings from not only those he was sold to, but even in his own family. The avoidance of bitterness that so easily can and sometimes does find a glue-like place in our souls and is an essential principle of both the Old and New Testaments. The teaching of Yeshua to turn the other cheek to those who slap us on the one side is not original with him. It's a principle that Jeremiah already had. And before Jeremiah, King David. And as concerns us today, a principle that Joseph lived out. About 11 years had passed since his older brothers had sold Joseph into slavery. He's 28 years old now. I wonder if Joseph still thought his dreams of his family bowing down to him that had much to do with his current condition bore any significance. Or were they just that, dreams of childhood? I mean, how could any human being not wonder, despite the acute level of faith and trust that Joseph had, because from where he sat, so long removed from Canaan and from his family, he may well have pushed to the background his dream visions about those sheaves of grain bowing down to him, the sun and the moon, the 11 stars paying homage to him. But let's be very clear about what those dreams meant to Joseph. It meant to him that provided he was properly understanding them, he was going to get the firstborn blessing of his father Jacob, called Israel. That means that the first 10 of his older brothers would be skipped over. He would become the inheritor of all the wealth and authority of the clan of Israel. Joseph is sitting in prison because the wife of his Egyptian master, Potiphar, lied, said he tried to assault her. I mean, how long he'd been languishing in prison is difficult to know, but it was long enough that he gained the trust of the jailer. And then something happened. And Pharaoh became angry with two high government officials, the official cupbearer and the head baker. These were not servant positions, although everybody, by definition, was subservient to Pharaoh. No, these men were likely right behind Potiphar in authority. But as is often the case with Orientals, remembering it was Orientals, Semites, not Egyptians, now ruling Egypt, some unknown offense winds up costing these men their freedom and maybe their lives. Likely as not, the Pharaoh simply was in a bad mood. Or unknowingly, as these two officials were apparently Egyptian, they committed some faux pas of Oriental sensibilities, and these two men wind up arrested. And like Joseph, held in the house of the prison captain, not the regular prison, as the common folk had to suffer. Well, after some time, Joseph noticed one morning that they both had puzzled and bothered countenances, and he inquired what troubled them. They each reported that he'd had a dream, and they couldn't understand what it meant. See, it wasn't that these men saw danger in their dreams. It was that in prison, there were no seers available, no dream interpreters to tell them the significance of their night visions. See, dreams were considered to be important in that era, so there were professional dream interpreters available for a fee. We begin to see the level of faith to which all of Joseph's sufferings had taken him as he responds, "Don't interpretations belong to God?" And he says, "Tell me your dreams." Well, they proceed with the cupbearer going first, and he speaks of a vine with 3 branches, grapes forming on the branches, which he makes into wine for the Pharaoh, and instantly God gives Joseph the meaning. And Joseph tells the cupbearer some good news. Within 3 days, the Pharaoh will reinstate the cupbearer to his position. All will be well. It seems now to have emboldened the baker, who undoubtedly, as a result of witnessing the interpretation of the cupbearer's dream, expected equally as good news. The baker, who of course dreamt within the context of his own life experiences, just as the cupbearer had done with his own, saw 3 baskets of bread on his head, apparently stacked one upon the other. And for the uppermost basket, it attracted birds, which came and ate the baked goods right from the basket while still on the baker's head. Joseph had to tell the baker the bad news, that on the same day that the cupbearer was going to be restored, the baker would lose his life. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Now, no doubt, Joseph now had his confidence return, that the dreams he dreamt those many years ago were valid. God did speak to him in his dreams. He did understand them correctly, as he was all able to accurately discern the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer. You know, it's hard to beat actual life experiences to confirm or to disrupt how we thought things are. And it's why the privilege of living a long time can provide one not necessarily with more knowledge, but rather more wisdom. Nonetheless, yet another lesson is to be learned. The last sentence of this week's Torah portion is a rather sad one, but so typical of mankind. Joseph, having shown such kindness to the cupbearer, had requested that the cupbearer might do the same for him after being restored to his position. But we are told that now that everything was back to normal for the cupbearer, he forgot about poor Joseph, left him languishing away for a crime he'd not committed. Now, since we won't be studying the next Torah portion next week, which begins with Genesis 41, I want to bring to a conclusion this matter of Joseph in prison and his dreams. 2 years pass from the end of the previous chapter and the baker and the cupbearer dream incident. Joseph is nearing 30 years old. Prison still his home. Dreams have so far been accurately interpreted, but also nothing but trouble for Joseph. That's about to change. The Pharaoh has two dreams. They're disturbing to him. Why disturbing? Because they seemed so real that after he awoke, he was relieved to realize they were just dreams. Or so he thought. Yet the content was such that they seemed more than a dream, more like a vision. So he felt he must pursue the meaning. So he calls all of his magicians, his wise men, to tell him the meaning of these dreams. And these two groups of men the Pharaoh summoned were his brain trust, his governmental cabinet. They represented the spiritual and the intellectual elite of Egypt, and they were stymied. Pharaoh tells these men about his dreams, but they stood silent, having no understanding as to their meaning. The chief cupbearer, who had been imprisoned by Pharaoh 2 years past, now reluctantly steps forward, and he tells Pharaoh about this Joseph, who accurately interpreted his and the chief baker's dreams. And Pharaoh immediately orders Joseph to be brought before him. Pharaoh tells Joseph he has had dreams, which his brightest and best could not interpret, but that he was told that Joseph could. Joseph answers completely truthfully, because through life experience, he knows it to be true. He says, "It isn't in me. God will give Pharaoh his answer." First, Joseph makes it clear that these dreams are from God. And next, he informs Pharaoh that both of these dreams are concerning the same matter, a coming time of great famine. And what comes next is wisdom from Joseph about what to do about the coming trial. And of course, the nature of the wisdom is such that we can have no doubt as to its source. It's from the Creator of all. Joseph says in paraphrase, "Pharaoh, during the next 7 years, make it a law that all throughout Egypt, 20% of all produce will be stored away for that day, 7 years rather into the future, when it'll be needed for these lean times." Pharaoh believed Joseph. Joseph was put in charge to see to it that what is needed happens. Joseph is now second only to Pharaoh over the entire land of Egypt. Joseph has been vindicated, and his faith takes yet another leap because he sees that his suffering has been for a far greater cause than only himself. So I say to us all, have faith, especially when things seem the worst. God is true to his promises. They will not fail. But suffering can and likely will be part of the journey to arrive at the fulfillment of those promises.
For more teachings and information, visit us online today. Come and be a part of our fellowship here at The Seed. Enjoy worshiping and learning God's Word with us.